Anyway, let's move on and get into the word today. I want to, as I was preparing, I don't know if you understand what it's like, but as a pastor, a lot of times what I talk about, I'm forced to live before I actually talk about it. And sometimes it's more fun than other times. When I'm talking about prospering, that's always a good time, and it's not always like that. And the particular message that I want to share today has been a process that God has been working on with me over a period of time, and He still is. It's not the end of this process, but my prayer is that through the book of Exodus and through the life of Moses, God would reveal something about ourselves that will help us on our journey. And so I'm just going to read a passage of scripture and then talk about it a little bit, if that's all right. So if you are reading along, I'm going to be reading from Exodus chapter 3. And I'm going to read a little bit longer passage than that. So that's verse 10, but I'm going to start a little bit earlier, up in about verse 4. So it says, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I thought I deserved a clap for that. I did that all in one go and did not get one of those wrong. I thought that was pretty impressive, and there were many times that I wanted to add like Vegemites and use an Australian joke, and I didn't. Verse 9 says, and now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So, as I gave a quick rundown of the history of the context for this book last week, and very quickly, Moses was born into a tumultuous time where the nation of Israel wasn't really a nation yet. There were a group of families that lived in Egypt, and they were treated as slaves, and to try and eliminate or weaken the Israelites, the Egyptians decided to kill off all of the male children. And so Moses' mom saw something in this boy and thought, he's better off in the hands of God by placing him in a basket in a river. Have you ever thought about that as a concept? You know what? For the best for my son, let's just put him in a river full of crocodiles. Yeah, that's what the Nile was like, right? And so he goes down the river, and he's, rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And then he grows up and makes a decision that he's going to side with the Hebrews rather than with the Egyptians, right? And he finds a guard or a slave driver, whatever, abusing a fellow Hebrew, and he kills him, buries him in the sand, and runs off. And then he moves to Midian, right? Marries Zipporah. They have a couple kids. Life's going pretty good. He's like a goat herder, like the Prince of Zamunda, right? And things are going well in his life. He's there for 40 years, and God shows up on the scene. Now, I want to point out that every sermon I have heard relating to this particular passage is always about God's revelation of himself. And that's fantastic. But I want to point out that there's something going on in this story as well about God's revelation, not only of who he is, but also of who Moses is. See, in the church, we're taught a lot about God in the hope that one day, the more we understand about God, the more it will fix us. When the reality is that we can know all about God and not be fixed. We can know so much we can quote scripture. I've met people that know the Bible like the back of their hand. But they're still a mess. We can fully understand all the big Bible, Hebrew and Greek and all this sort of fancy stuff. But still be a little boy or a little girl that's never addressed the issues in their life that have brought them to where they are. See, Moses at this point, in all the movies like Charlton Heston's like, looks like he's 35 years old. He's 80 at this point. Right? And God is trying to bring something to the fore and address not only who he is and reveal and bring restoration and liberation to the nation of Israel, but in the process, he wants to transform Moses as well. And I was thinking about it this morning, and Moses struggled with belonging. Think about it for a second. He's a guy that doesn't fit in anywhere. He's the only one of the Hebrews of his generation. Think about that for a second. All of his playmates were murdered. Not only that, he had Hebrew blood, but Egyptian philosophy. He wanted to be with his people, but his people didn't see him as one of them. They saw him as an Egyptian. And the Egyptians saw him as a Hebrew. Can anyone relate to that? Can anyone maybe see that we straddle these different worlds? We don't fully fit in with our peers because there's something about us that's a little bit different. We don't fully fit in the world that's around us because we've been injured by the world that's around us, and we place these walls to protect us from being hurt, because many of us have been hurt by the fact that we don't belong. Moses at last has found where he belongs. Moses at last has got a family. Jethro is a father. He's got a wife. He's got children. He's got a job. He's doing something meaningful. He has something in his life, yet there's still something missing for Moses. And God turns around and says, I want you to go to the place of your rejection. I want you to go back to the place to find out what's really inside of you, because the reason that you don't fit in is the reason that you're not really fulfilling my purpose in your life. And can I tell you, not only for me, but the church across the world is rife with this problem. We are full of people that know all about God but don't know anything about ourselves. We can quote chapter and verse, but many of us have decided to never address the issues in our own life because they're too painful. And we'll never truly be who God has called us to be if we can't Be self-aware. Because the verse I had up there is verse 10. But verse 11 says this. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? Who am I? See, that's the question that many of us miss in this conversation. God has brought revelation. There's this flame that's not burning the tree. There's a miraculous. God speaks from a fire. Think about that for a second. He's turning his face, and then God says, I want you to do this. And he's like, me? Honestly, who's ever done that? Who's ever done? Oh, but God, like, let me school you for a second. Let me educate you on who you're talking to. Like God doesn't know who he's talking to. The thing starts by him saying Moses. He knows exactly who he's talking to. He knows exactly where he's been. He knows all of his story. And in the midst of it yet, he still chose him. And many of us, God has still chosen you, even though all the list of things that you want to use to disqualify yourself. God knows us. I went to Bible college in the mid-90s. I'm aging myself by doing this. But I didn't grow up in the church, right? So it was like a very weird experience for me. All of a sudden, I'm in Christian land. Right? I'm surrounded by all these people that use all this like biblical terminology, and they knew how to play the game. Like all these kids have grown up, a lot of them were pastors' kids, they've grown up in church all their life, they knew the church game, they knew the language, they knew how to get it, and I didn't know it at all, and I was still pretty raw. You know the saying, you can take the boy out of Brooklyn, but you can't take Brooklyn out of the boy? You know, that was me. I was the fish out of water in this whole world, right? I didn't really know how I fitted in. And at the time, I used that to be, well, if you're not going to accept me, I'm going to definitely make sure that you decide not to accept me because of the stuff that I do. I had an attitude problem. I was mouthy to my professors. I was a little bit too witty and they couldn't really handle it, you know. Back in those days, Christians didn't have a sense of humor, and some still don't, but and so, you know, I was like quick-witted and they just weren't used to it, you know, and I didn't have any respect because, you know, I didn't have any respect for myself. So I thought if I don't have, you know, I'm philosophizing about myself right now, but at the time I didn't understand, but I was just quick-witted, and I never really felt like I belonged in this world. But yet, I still knew that I was called. See, God had a calling for my life, and God used the circumstances of what seemed like rejection to actually reveal the stuff that was truly going on inside of me. And of course, my reaction was wrong. I rebelled against it rather than going, you know what is it about me that needs to change? But many of us in the church, we've been Christians for 30 years and we're still doing the same thing. We're still coming up with the reasons that we can't serve God rather than the reasons that we can. We spend a lot of time looking, you know, God, look at that. Those people are the ones that you should pick because they can play the game better than me. And there are many people that put on a mask when they go to church, where inside they've never truly addressed the stuff that's gone on that makes them where they are. Our culture needs to be built on biblical principles, but many of us are still built on the home that we grew up in rather than the things of God. It might look nice, but the underlying beliefs underneath that can be quite far from God. And I believe that if we're truly to fulfill God's plan and purpose in our life, yes, we need to know and understand God. We need to know that He's called us, but we also need to know that He knows better than I do, and that I have a responsibility to address the issues in my own life. And I'm not saying that you can heal yourself, but I am saying that before we truly are going to be whole, we need to learn to open ourselves up to God, to allow Him to reveal who we truly are. Did you get that? We need to learn to open ourselves up to God so that He can reveal who we truly are. Because the reality is, He knows us better than we know us. But we struggle to acknowledge that. How many times have you prayed, God, you don't know me? And He's like, really? Really? Psalm 56 says, I've taken account of your wanderings. I hold your tears in a bottle. God knows everything about us. And better, more than that, He named us. It's interesting that when you read the commentary about Moses in the other books of the Bible, it paints a different picture. Moses, you see in Exodus, a story of rejection and a story of not belonging in either world. But yet, if you come down to Acts, in the sermon that Stephen preaches, in Acts 7:20, it says, at this time that Moses was born, he was well-pleasing to God. God had a plan for him, for his birth. He was saved for a reason from the beginning. Even though he fell away and, ran off and all this sort of stuff, God knew from the beginning who he was and what he called him to be. And the problem was that Moses had tried to fulfill his call his own way. He knew there was something unique about him. He knew that he was the only one of his generation. Who else was going to lead his people? So he thought, instead of waiting for God to reveal the plan and purpose of liberation, that he would liberate himself. And so he killed an Egyptian guard. But him attempting to fulfill God's plan his way, he messed everything up. Even in Hebrews it says, by faith, Hebrews 11:23 says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. Not only was God with Moses, but God even used circumstances of people around Moses' life to prepare him for the very call that he had. And when you read through the Bible, you find time and time again that there's a story. Who's read the book of Ruth? What's the point of the book of Ruth? Boaz is a good dude, If you think about it, the book of Ruth actually is summarized in the last couple of verses. That basically says that Boaz is David's great-great-great-great-granddaddy. That God had a plan that he was going to do, and he used generations to get there. And some of us, God has been at work in your life behind the scenes for so long, but you think that because you've messed up, that therefore you're disqualified. And I want to tell you today that that's not true. That if God can choose Moses, a guy who tried in his own strength and failed, then God can use you. What's amazing is when you read the passage, starting in chapter 3, God does this amazing story and he reveals, I am that I am. And if you're watching the movies, it's like, whoa. All right? And then Moses' response is, nah. Think about that for a second, right? But he doesn't actually say no once. He actually says no multiple times. If you look, go further down, Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. It says, then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. So one, he says, don't pick me. Two, he says, they're not going to believe me, right? They already hate me. And then in verse 10, he says, but Moses said to the Lord, oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. They're not going to believe me. I'm not a good talker. All right? Verse 13. He said, oh Lord, please send someone else. Lord, can you please pick someone else? Things are going good right now. I'm in the tent. I got a wife. I got some goats. I'm living the dream. It's interesting that all of his responses, God gives him an answer, and he still has says no. He's like, who am I going to say sent me? Okay, tell them I am that I am. I'm the God of your fathers. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Go to them, and they'll, okay, no. They'll listen to you. Go and speak to them. But I can't speak. I'm going to send your brother. And he's a good speaker. Now, he's got some other issues in his life, right? But I'm going to send him, and he's going to come and meet you, and he's going to prepare a plan together. I'm going to work miracles through you. Grab your stick, throw it on the ground, turns into a snake. What? Get your hand, stick it in your jacket, bring it out. It's got leprosy. Put it back in, leprosy gone. Like whole next level David Copperfield business going on here, right? God does all of this, and he still says no. And we look at him and we laugh and go, isn't that terrible? But you do exactly the same thing. And so do I, all the time. God has shown us time after time he's been faithful, and yet we still struggle to be a part of what he wants to do, because we struggle to see God's victory because we can't see past our own failure. We struggle to see God's plan because we can't see past our own lack of ability. To truly fulfill God's plan and purpose in our lives, we need to learn to really die to ourselves and acknowledge, you know better than me. Think about the arrogance of all the times that we've negotiated with God. Come on. I want you to do this. Okay, instead of that, got a great idea. I'll do this, which is like even harder. You know, Saul's kingdom was rejected for that very thing. Lack of obedience. And David, even though he was a mess, at least he owned his mess. David, not only did he own his mess, he wrote songs about it. Think about that for a second. So here's the point of all of what I want to say. If you want to write down notes or something. Failure is not what disqualifies us. Facing failure is what qualifies us. Get that? Failure is not what disqualifies us. The things that we've been through, the pains that we've experienced, the stuff that's gone on in our life that we think were there to shipwreck us and destroy us, we're not there to destroy us, they're there to build us and to make us something special. They're there to make us have compassion. They're there to make us to be different and to see things differently. When we go to the end of our rope and we've got nothing left, we realize that God is all we have, that we realize that God is all we need. But for many of us, we think that God has abandoned us because He's allowed us to go through things rather than realizing it's the process of development so that we can be who He's called us to be. And that even though Moses had faced rejection after rejection, he was going back as a different person that left. And some of us, God has asked us to do something which is completely out of our comfort zone, but He's worked a work to develop us into the person that He can fully trust to fulfill His purpose. We were pastors of a church. We planted a church in Sydney, and things were going great. And we'd run out of space where we were, and we needed to find a new facility. And we found this building, and it was amazing. It needed a lot of work. They'd used it to store old mattresses. So it was and before that, it had been a machine shop. So the oil was an inch thick on the ground. It was nuts. And because of all the mattresses, they were full of rats, right? So it was fun. I got to go and see it because the roller door was just open. It was just completely open. So I turned up, pushed, I didn't even have to. I just walked in, looked around the building, Everything had gone on in there was horrific. But it was really big, and it was in the location that we wanted it to be. So we're really excited about it. So we signed a lease on this building, and we'd been saving for a couple of years to be able to do this, right? So we had I think there was $30,000 in the bank, here you go, $30,000. But for us, we were a small church, sort of lower socioeconomic area. $30,000 was a big deal to us, and we'd spent a couple of years putting that money away. So we were we thought it was an achievement. So we signed this lease, right? And then I went, and our accounts were actually being done by somebody else. So I went to our accountant, and I was like, whoa, come on, we signed a building, it's crazy, and we got the money to pay the rent because we got this 30 grand, and we're going to use some of that to do up the building and everything. And he's like, 30 grand? And I was like, yeah, 30 grand, it's in the bank, here's the report, and it's got $30,000, in that account, so we got 30 grand. He goes, aha. But there's another report where you got $30,000 in the negative in that account. So when everything came out, we actually had $2,000 in the bank, which wasn't even enough to pay our first month's rent in the building. And I'm like, well, that meeting sucked. And I walked out, and I'm like, God, how can you do this to me? And, and I was, but in my mind, right, up until that point, I'd worked as a fundraiser. I was really good at raising money. I had, in the jobs that I had $5 million targets for raising money. Something like 30 grand, or, I was hoping a little bit more, 50 grand. I can raise 50 grand, no problem. I'll come up with this letter, and I'll do this, and I'll contact these people. And in my mind, I'm doing this whole plan in my head of how I'm going to do it, right? Based on my experience, and God's used all these experiences to get me here. And I felt God very clearly say, stop. He said, if you raise it, you'll think that you did it. But you're not going to do it. I'm going to do it. And then, so we said, okay, all we're going to do is we're going to tell our church we're going to take up a miracle offering. Right? That was it. And I felt that God was all over that. And so it was great. Right, we're going to do this offering. I don't know how much is going to come in. If we got $5,000 in that offering, I would have been stoked. Again, maybe half of our church was single mums, right? I was like, this, $5 grand will be amazing. Anyway, the week before our miracle offering, a missionary comes to speak at church. Now, you guys don't get this, right? But you never want a missionary to come and speak at church for a week before you're doing an offering, right? Because missionaries come, they show pictures of like kids, and everyone feels bad and gives them money, right? So I'm like, oh man, that's the worst, but I agreed. Anyway, this guy comes and he's amazing. He doesn't even talk about what he's doing. He just talks about generosity and God's heart. And he was just phenomenal. Just spoke into our life of our church. And it was just, an amazing service. And I'm sitting there in the front row, and I just felt God say, you got to take an offering for this guy. And I'm like, what? It's like next week. God, next week is the miracle offering. You understand? God. Next week, miracle offering, missionary offering, bad. Right? But again, you got to do what you're told. So I get up, and I'm not enthusiastic, right? I'm just like, we're going to take up an offering for this guy. Anyway, we take up an offering. $700 comes in, all right? And again, you might not be enthusiastic, but it was the biggest mission offering we'd ever taken, $700. I'm like, wow, man, that's pretty cool, But, in my mind, I'm subtracting 700 from the 5,000 I'm going to get next week. So I give them, I don't know if you've ever done this, but have you held on to something so hard that the president cries, right? I had this offering I'm giving this guy, and I'm holding on to it and giving it, but I'm not joyfully giving it, right? Anyway, I give this offering, and let's just say I'm just a little bit deflated, right? Because I'm like, God, I thought we had a plan. I thought me and you were in this together. And so anyway, I left. I was outside. I was talking to someone from church, and this guy comes up to me, and he says, oh, Pastor, can I have a word with you for a second? And I said, yeah. And he goes, I want to give you this. And he gave me a check for $7,000. And we took up the offering the next week, and we got $28,000. And then the next week, in the church's offering, came in another $15,000. This is in a church that you would not expect that sort of money to come in an offering. It was just phenomenal. And the thing that I realized is that God has got it if I just allow Him to do what He does in my life and in my situation. And God had told Moses that He was going to bring deliverance for His people, but Moses is still thinking, I got to do this. Rather than going, you know what, even though I've messed up, I'm going to be faithful and do what you asked me to do. I'm going to stand before Pharaoh. And He even tells him, Pharaoh is going to say no. And the thing that freaks me out the most about this story is he says, I'm going to give you a sign. And the sign is when it's all finished, you're going to come back here and worship me. Huh? What sort of sign is that? I want a sign in the middle of it. I want to be able to fly, I want to levitate in the middle of my meeting with Pharaoh, that's the sort of sign I want. But I want to finish with this. If God chooses you, who are you to tell God that He's wrong? If God chooses you, who do you think you are to tell God that He's got it wrong? It takes some level of arrogance to think that we know God's plan better than He does. We're going to ask the worship team to come up, and we're going to finish with worship. But as we do, I want to ask you the question that I think is the underlying question. I think Moses, instead of saying, not me, maybe should have asked, why me? And I think for some of us, rather than looking at our past, rather than looking at our history, rather than looking at what we did wrong, rather than even looking at our strengths, because sometimes God asks us to do things that are outside of our strength, outside of our comfort zone, outside of our abilities, because He wants to show that He's in charge. He wants to show that He's faithful. He wants to show that He can overcome anything that you've been through to bring miracles into the world, into people's situation. And we need to be learning to ask, why me? Why do I have these feelings? Why do I have this emotion? Why am I afraid? Because it's when we ask those questions that God answers them and explains to us why. And that's the process. Moses had to go through a process. The process doesn't end there. All throughout, God is engaging with Moses, and it's interesting that God chooses to connect with Moses, but Aaron to the people. You read through Exodus, God doesn't talk to Aaron. He talks to Moses. But then Moses talks to Aaron, and Aaron talks to the people. I don't know why God chooses us the way that He does. I don't know why He picks me. I don't know why He picks you. I don't know. I don't understand His will. There are lots of people that I see serving God, and I'm like, I wouldn't have picked them. Come on. But who are we to say that we know better than God? Who are we to think that we understand? When God sees and understands things, He plays at a level. I was watching a video recently of this guy who was playing chess with like 12 people at once. Right, you know those people that are like brilliant at it? And he was like walking around playing chess. He'd like walk, I'm going bang, 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 bang. And he like beat all these 12 people all at the same time. And we're sitting there with our dinky little chess table, and God's playing 12 of us and beating us all at the same time. But we think that we're the master. So we're going to spend some time in worship. But as we do, just before we do actually, I want you to ask this question. Who am I? God, who am I? Not who are you. He's revealed who He is. But I believe that God wants to reveal who you are. Can we stand? And these guys are just going to play for a second before they lead us in a song that's going to remind us of this truth. But just where we are, in the next minute, can you ask God, who am I? Who have you called me to be? What's my name? Why did you pick me? God, you know what I've been through. You know the stuff that's happened in my life. You know the challenges that I've overcome. You know how many times I've got it wrong. You know the sin that so easily entangles me. You know that I'm a mess. Why me? Because I believe He wants to answer that question.